Thanks for listening and watching in this presentation of the theme of merging churches. I think it's an idea whose time has come, and that's what I'm entitling this, Merging Churches, an idea whose time has come. This area of church revitalization, I believe it is a strategy that has become essential in these days. Reasons for that are these. First of all, while we certainly need to be about the business of starting new churches, that's always our command and our directive, there are communities where some churches are just struggling to survive. Necessary health restrictions of the present pandemic, this crisis, have impacted some of these even more than what they were before. If the statistics are anywhere near accurate about local church existence after the new normal comes, then some of these churches prior that were struggling previously are just going to go out of business. They're just going to shut down. And that's going to impact so many people in so many areas. The second reason why I think this needs to be addressed and why it's an idea whose time has come is because, speaking of those local church demographics, many churches right now consist of good folks who for many years have been faithful. They've worked hard, they've sacrificed, they have served and done everything necessary that their church would be effective, and they honored the Lord with all of that. But these good folks have grown significantly older. They no longer have the health, the physical stamina, and the financial resources that they used to have in order to keep up the church. And so they're in a pickle about what to do. And again, that's another reason for addressing this issue of merging churches. A third reason is that merging churches as a strategy for ministry also relates to the decreasing pool of pastors that we have these days. Many churches just cannot find a pastor, even if they are able to support one financially, because their pastors are just not there like they used to be in the sense of pastors filling pulpits and being available. Many of our pastors, many that I know personally, have come out of retirement in order just to fill the pulpit in what is often a declining church. They're ministering to those congregations who love having them, love hearing them preach, but the truth is their future is very limited under those circumstances. Many of these pastors, for example, cannot live in the community where they minister, and that automatically limits the future of that ministry, what can be done and what's coming in the future. And while I hope this is not going to become the usual situation, it is entirely possible that churches in any given community will need to merge in order just to have a pastor from the limited numbers that are available. A couple of generations ago, interestingly enough, that itself was a typical situation. Well, we need to be open to those possibilities in order to continue ministry. But that's just another reason why merging churches needs to be considered. And a fourth and final reason that I'll give here about merging churches and why it's important is while there are different scenarios about church mergers, and I'll address that later, and some churches just do not have the ministry resources to expand their efforts, and so they're just stuck. But there are churches that do have ministry resources, and they are looking to expand that ministry in other areas. Now, I'm personally not a big fan of the satellite church as such, but I acknowledge that some are doing that and are having a good ministry and need to make the most of all that structure implies. And so that's just another model of what merging churches involves. So in this particular presentation, I want to address this topic of church mergers and some of the reasons why I think it is indeed an idea whose time has come. It is a subject that could and perhaps should command a lot of attention. but I intend to focus at the end on what I consider to be the most common situations and questions about local churches merging. Let me first of all address this issue in this whole scenario. There are materials and counsel that's available. So if churches are looking to investigate, see what's out there, there are some very good materials and counsel that's available about this very issue. For example, the book Better Together, Making Church Mergers Work by Tomberlin and Bird is an excellent, it's the best resource that I have. But also the counsel of those who have worked through such mergers is invaluable. What they bring to the table and insights that they have go beyond the book statements. May I say that my own experience with this recently has taught me some things that we did right in that process, but also it has taught me some things that we needed to do better. And so that kind of counsel is just very important in this whole setup. If there are those that are hearing this seminar who would contemplate a church merger, give me a call. I'll be happy to talk about it further with you if you're interested. And the second area I want to address with this is the biblical basis of merging. I think it's important for us to always base what we do in the church, especially on biblical principles and biblical truth. I believe there is a definite biblical basis for churches merging. I think, first of all, for example, the gospel of Christ, the fact that it is intended for all people. The Great Commission is totally inclusive of all people and people groups, means that there is something of a merger that happens whenever people believe in Christ. There is a unique fellowship that is instantly bonding about all of that. Second area of the biblical basis is that if you read carefully the book of Acts, or even casually the book of Acts, you will find that Jewish and Gentile believers often met together in one local church setting. In the beginning of the book of Acts, the church at Jerusalem is the predominant, the mother church, as it were. But once you get to chapter 11 and forward, that focus shifts to the church at Antioch of Syria. And it was there at Antioch of Syria that Gentile and Jewish believers labored together and became something of the home church, the headquartering church for the Apostle Paul in his missionary journeys. After every journey, he made it a point to go home to the church at Antioch and report what had happened. Well, there, those believers in the Antioch church would have been very receptive to the fact that Paul had won people to Christ of all stripes of humanity. And so if you'll examine that church, Acts 11, Acts 13, you'll find a model of church merging. And then in texts like Romans 11, Ephesians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul states that Gentile believers are grafted into the body of Christ and that they become part of the household of God. I think that these ideas, these concepts, can be understood in the terms of merging together as believers, set apart in Christ, bonded together by the gospel. And so again, it's a biblical basis of merging. And I think you'll find too that as Paul addresses specific church needs, like in the Corinthian epistles, he is clear that the Lord is not pleased with divisions over incidentals and trivialities. There are big things to address, but when it's personality or trivial issues, then these are not really the basis for separations. And so I think the Bible gives us a great basis for churches merging together, beginning with the gospel itself and then the practice of the New Testament church. Merging of churches requires us to consider more of what local churches have in common than what they might disagree about. They have to look at the big ideas and they have to give themselves in a fresh way to what is most important. I think most of all, those involved in merging churches need to use all the wisdom available, all the prayer possible, all the qualities of biblical leadership that's needed for such. It is not easy, nor is it a simple union. Above all, the Lord's favor has to be sought, and all personal spiritual adjustments made under His lordship in order for any local church to succeed, but especially when churches merge together. I'll probably say it again as the matter of course here, but believers must become better Christians if they are going to merge churches together. But isn't that necessary, especially in these days? A third area to consider in merging churches is this. There are different terms that are being used for churches merging together today. Terminology seems to make a difference in folks and how they perceive what this is all about. And so terminology may be very important when even talking about the possibilities. For example, some suggest that family terms should be used when we talk about churches merging. Terms like adoption, one church adopting another, or fostering others, like parents, caring parents can take care of or reach out to needy children. That's a great term, a great idea, a great concept. And so churches might see themselves and that relationship and that role. And those terms, of course, can be appealing. So one church could say, we're praying about adopting a church down the road or across the community. We're praying about fostering another church, or churches even, in this case. I think those are good terms to consider and may very well help people to perceive what this is all about. Another area about terminology that's being used is a business model. Terms that are used like merging, which I've used here, or even purchasing assets. I've seen that used a couple of times. And then reassignment. These are business models that are brought to bear in the analogy of churches joining together. Of course, we're all familiar with business mergers like banks and gas stations and stores and so on. And while there are certainly business aspects of churches joining together, those terms tend to be a little less personal. At some point in the process, you have to talk about things like finances and assets and so on, but to characterize a church merger or blending or an adoption or a fostering of church in a business term may become a little too impersonal, but it is used. I find myself using the term merger most often, but not in my mind in a restrictive business sense, but in the sense that believers merging together is the idea. A third area of terminology is using partnering terms like uniting or even reuniting, or the term partnering together. Carries with it the idea of the concept of believers coming together with a common purpose, in this case the blending of local church bodies, members, assets, and everything in order to perpetuate its ministry and have an impact in a fresh way. I personally like these terms, the terms of partnering. They seem to best fit the model, and in discussing with others, that's usually what I talk about. But merger is the main term that I use just in common. Now, let me address the area that there are different models and methods for churches to emerge. To do something, generally, it helps to have a model. It helps to have something after which you pattern your actions. And so let me give you some models and methods about that. Suggest these because there are certainly no restricted ones. Every circumstance is going to be different, but here's some ideas about it. Some churches, for example, may unite in order to expand their ministry. I reference satellite churches often use this approach. This is nothing new. It's been going on for a good while now. The idea is that one larger church with means and abilities partners perhaps with a smaller, often struggling church in order to establish an extension of that larger church into that community or that area. The smaller church, usually in this setting, surrenders its previous name and its identity. The structures all depend then on what is agreed by both parties. And so here you have an expansion, the satellite idea of this. Now, secondly, some may need to unite in order to restore fellowship and testimony. I'm being pretty bold here by that statement, but I do think it's true, and I speak with respect. Some churches divided years ago over doctrinal necessities. That was particularly true in some areas where doctrinal issues became priority concerns. I have pastored and worked with a couple of those types of churches where good men and women believed that there were doctrinal issues sufficient to separate in order to preserve those doctrinal truths. Those churches are still going strong today, Matt. I hope I contributed to that, but I believe that the Lord honored their concern for doctrinal truth. Many churches, however, divide over other issues, and we're all aware of that, very much so. It isn't necessary here for me to list any of these other issues. There are far too many different sides to any one particular circumstance than for me to make any kind of judgments about it, except to say it happens, and it has happened. Some of these situations, and this is my point, some of these situations perhaps should be reconciled. It may go a long way for the Christian lives of those individuals involved, as well as the testimony in a community for that to happen. In many cases, that which happened in separation a long time ago has gone away. There's a new sense of fellowship and relationship that has developed, and churches laboring together in different settings, whereas previously they had separated. In some of these situations, it seems to me that churches in a given community ought to rethink then their future together. It may very well be that the reuniting of these churches would bring fresh spiritual life and ministry to everyone involved. Now, my particular focus with this is on this last scenario, this last model, and that is some churches need to unite just for the sake of survival. This is rapidly becoming the number one reason for merging, as I alluded to in the introduction to this. I don't want to paint a bleak picture about this scenario, but quite frankly, my concerns outweigh my reticence. I personally had rather see churches merge or unite than to close. I think the kingdom of God as a whole loses a foothold of influence when churches close for whatever reasons. I'd much rather see churches find a means of merging and uniting. And I think I'm making a personal appeal here for us to consider that if churches are about to close, why don't we be open to reuniting or uniting? On a personal note, I have been in discussions with lots of our local and state leaders in the last few months who are very concerned about the future of many of our churches, as am I. It is nearly unanimous in all of the discussions that unless some of our churches merge, they will soon close. That situation has been exaggerated because of the pandemic circumstances that we're all trying to figure out. I do not want to sound like an alarmist, nor to presume on the Lord's will for His church, but I do believe this need is undeniable. And so whatever the model or method is for churches to merge, there are good reasons for that to be considered, particularly if churches are just struggling to survive. When churches unite, then there are some things that are essential to know and to plan for. And this is the climax of what I want to say in this particular seminar. I want to give 8 essentials that are necessary, that I've learned, read, studied about, so forth myself, that are necessary for churches to be involved with if they're going to have a successful reunion. I'm not going to address some of the things that can derail church mergers, however. These are just as impactful as the things that are required. That's a subject for another day. What can prevent? And you can almost see that in these 8 different areas, these 8 principles, these precepts, that the opposite of them is what would derail a church merger. In the last couple of months, I've heard 2 stories, and this would represent a number of circumstances, and I'm sure not going to make any specific references here. I've heard of churches who talked about this, prayed about it, but when it came to that issue, they failed to merge together. I asked why, I was given reasons and so forth. But then I've also talked to others who are saying, we are afraid to address this. We don't know exactly what to expect. Well, that's why I'm looking at this, and I hope we'll give you some suggestions and give some positive input about it. So here are the 8 essentials for churches merging as I see them. First of all parties involved need to ultimately consider the will of God about the merger. Is there a biblical basis? Oh, I absolutely believe that. Believers laboring together, being in harmony and fellowship and of the same mind and same purpose. Godly men and women, I believe, need to fast and pray over this. A lot. It's not an easy thing. And there's a lot of soul searching that needs to go into this. But godly men and women need to be godly men and women in this circumstance. They need to rise to the occasion. They need to discern the will of God about the merger. Second element, timing. It's possible to attempt to merge too soon. It's also possible to wait too long. You can miss the window of opportunity if you're not careful. I, again, know a number of situations where folks told me, we should have considered this a long time ago. But we're in a pickle now. We just don't know if we can do this now. I don't know that the Lord is ever unable to put circumstances together or not able to bring people to a fresh place of commitment and faith. But I understand what they're saying. They probably should have considered it, but it's not too late to do so now. And so my counsel would be to set an adequate amount of time to pray, to plan, to discuss, a specific time to have a vote, and then make the decision. And my prayer would be the decision would be according to the right timing and people's hearts being right, and that decision would be indeed to merge if that is indeed the case. A third element, a third essential is need to decide what facilities are going to be used if 2 or more churches merge. Facilities are a big part of local churches. The number one answer to that question is this: location, location, location. Which facility is best located in order to reach people for the foreseeable future? Even if it's not in the best of shape, it can be updated. But location outweighs every other consideration, in my opinion. But facilities are important here. A fourth element, who's going to be the pastor? It's an essential question, a key question that implies a lot of things. But one thing is for sure, there cannot be competing pastoral leadership. There must be complementary pastoral leadership. Who will be the pastor? That needs to be understood going into the merger circumstance. All parties need to be aware and involved with that decision and agreeing to it. And I'm speeding up a little bit for the sake of time, but a fifth element for merging is you have to consider the reasons or motives for merging. Motive is important in spiritual life. God judges the whys as well as the whats, why we do what we do. While merging may be necessary for survival, it is not a sufficient motive in itself. In my opinion, the best reason to merge is so there will be new, fresh, greater opportunities for ministry, and that people can labor together for the cause of Christ. I believe firmly that all involved must become better Christians, have greater capacities for fellowship, and that they have prayed much about this whole situation in order for it to be successful. Why is it being done? For the glory of God, for the advancement of His kingdom. That's why. Another element regarding churches merging is, how do you assimilate the memberships together? Who and how will members be determined? What about boards, teachers, leadership positions, classes, ministry outreaches? All of that has to be worked through and understood and agreed upon. Another area I found a very significant part of all of this was, do the key documents need updating? Some of our documents of our churches are so outdated, some are non-existent. Those documents are essential, especially in emerging churches circumstance. In our particular situation that I've experienced, our members and our board members of both churches were accepted as recommended and immediately given positional responsibility. It is a credit to everyone involved that there were no differences made with any of that. And so all the people that wanted to join from one church to another were immediately accepted. All the board members were immediately placed in position. There was no competitions about that. That's exactly, I think, the way that should work. What about finances? Is there any indebtedness? If so, like when you get married, then everybody becomes responsible. You can't escape it. What are the account balances? What are the systems of records and budgets? These should be priority. Finances is a very important part of this whole area of churches merging. Need to take a good, hard, detailed, factual look at everything about it. It's a great opportunity, by the way, to bring fresh approach to giving and updating records and so forth. And finally, the eighth element that I think is essential for churches merging is this: do not hesitate to get outside counsel. This is a way that is rare. It has not been followed very much. But the rarity does not mean it shouldn't be. There indeed are those who are experienced in this ministry and can be of invaluable service. There's good materials available, and therefore all of that needs to be addressed in the process ahead of time and in making an informed decision about churches merging. In conclusion, let me say this. I was speaking with someone from another denomination recently who came to our church for one of our particular ministry events just recently. He is very interested in the fact that he had heard from a distance about our churches merging. He was so complimentary and supportive. And he commented that he wished those in his church denomination, his group, would consider doing that very thing, because he knew enough to know that new churches were going to die unless they did. It shows, just from that one experience, though I have many, that many folks are aware of this need and hope for some kind of resolution and that believers come together in these potential circumstances. So I personally want to say again in conclusion, this is an idea whose time has come. It's come in our movement. I think we should do everything we can to make this a reality with a lot of our churches, do everything we can to contribute to its success. God bless. Thank you.